Hello and welcome to our special program on the situation in Europe. It's called Russian Invasion. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. For the next 50 minutes or so, we will be bringing you up to date on the developments and issues arising from day 2 of the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. The headlines. Fighting rages near Ukrainian capital Kiev as Russian forces aim to seize control of the city. There's resistance. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russian President Vladimir Putin intends to overthrow the democratically elected government in Ukraine. And global oil prices fluctuate, go to $105 a barrel before falling slightly. Fighting has intensified in the capital city of Kiev of the Ukraine as Russian forces advance, with reports of several explosions, gunfire and missile strikes being heard in or around the city early this morning. A Ukrainian Interior Ministry official claims that the Russian aircraft had been shot down over the Donetsk district of Kiev, although these reports are unconfirmed. Fighting is also raging at an airfield on the outskirts of Kiev, and it could become a springboard for the Russian army into the city if its troops seize it. Ukraine's deputy defense minister says Russian forces could enter the area just outside Kiev later today. Following clashes, Russian forces have seized control of the former Chernobyl nuclear complex in northernmost Ukraine, close to the Belarusian border and just 93 kilometers from Kiev. The U.S. says Ukrainian soldiers are being held. The U.S. also says that they've been trying to fend off the Russian invasion from 3 separate fronts. That is, the Ukrainians have been trying to fend off the invasion from 3 separate fronts, the north, the south, and east of the country, where fighting has been amongst the most fierce. And of course, we have told you that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has already been seized, in fact, by Russian forces. Presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak said the totally pointless attack, which started on Thursday, amounted to one of the most serious threats in Europe today. An explosion in Chernobyl in 1986 led to the worst nuclear disaster in human history, both in costs and casualties. Ukraine's president had warned such a disaster could happen again if Russia continued its invasion. The emergency EU leaders meeting on the Ukraine on Thursday, that's yesterday, was an emotional one, with officials feeling like it is the toughest and most difficult of EU summits ever. Many of them have said that Russia's actions in Ukraine impact many EU members directly and are also calling for unity. They believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin has his eye on much more than Ukraine, and that's that he wants to redesign the security architecture of Europe in his favor. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which used to be behind the Iron Curtain, now EU and NATO members, feel very exposed, particularly the Baltic states, which border Russia, who fear that the Kremlin intends to destabilize them with cyber attacks and more disinformation campaigns aimed at their ethnic Russian communities.
Early this morning,
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he's convinced Russian President Vladimir Putin will try to overthrow Ukraine's government. Mr. Blinken made the comments during an interview where he said he was convinced Mr. Putin would overthrow the government. He says, "I'm convinced he's going to try to do that." Mr. Blinken says part of the Russian plan had always been to put Kiev in danger, to assault the capital, and then go after other major cities in the Ukraine.
David, the sanctions that we've taken, not just us, in coordination with European partners and allies, are going to have severe consequences on Russia. Some immediate, some that play out over time. We've taken 10 largest financial institutions holding about 80% of Russia's banking assets, can't do transactions in dollars or for the most part in euros. The ability for Russia to raise money on international markets, we're taking that away. their ability to import the technology necessary to modernize their economy, to put into critical industries like defense, like aerospace, that too being taken away. And this is going to have a very significant impact. Now, having said that, as the president said, other things remain on the table. If they continue to escalate, we'll have the ability to do the same thing. You know, sanctions have an immediate impact. We're seeing that in terms of Russia's currency, in terms of its markets. But the impact is really felt over time as, again, it spreads across the economy about their ability to raise money, to conduct transactions around the world. That will be felt more and more and more over time. So if this continues, the pain will continue, the pain will grow, and that's going to have an effect too. Is it a possibility that Putin goes beyond Ukraine? Sure, it's a possibility, but there's something very powerful standing in the way of that. That's something we call Article 5 of NATO. That means an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all members of NATO. The President's been very clear that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. I think that's the most powerful deterrent against President Putin going beyond Ukraine. It's not a question, David, of all bets being off the table. It's being very clear that we are committed to Article 5. We're committed to defending our NATO allies. And if it comes to that, we'll do it. But right now, our focus is on Ukraine. Our focus is on trying to prevent President Putin from going even further. But it looks like he's going for everything he can get. And so we're doing what we said we would do all along. We're imposing massive costs. We're doing it with allies and partners. We're doing it together. We're doing it swiftly. And you've seen that already today.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And it's now 24 hours since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, bombing targets across the country and destroying critical military infrastructure. It's a full-scale invasion. The Ukrainian army is trying to repel a full-scale invasion with fierce battles taking place close to the capital. Fighting is also raging at an airfield on the outskirts of the city, which could become a springboard for the Russian army into the capital if its troops seize it.
Explosions rang out in the capital Kiev and other cities as Russia invaded Ukraine. They came after Russia's President Vladimir Putin ordered a military operation into Ukraine's east. Russian forces fired missiles at several cities and landed troops on Ukraine's southern coast. Several Ukrainian civilians were reportedly killed.
Телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared martial law. He also called on citizens to fight, saying weapons will be issued to everyone who wants them. Ukraine's allies have been quick to condemn Russia's actions and avowed hard-hitting sanctions.
Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. And to that end, we must also collectively cease the dependence on Russian oil and gas that for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics.
These sanctions are designed to take a heavy toll on the Kremlin's interests and their ability to finance war. And we know that millions of Russians do not want war. President Putin is trying to turn the clock back to the times of the Russian Empire. But in doing so, he is putting at risk the future of the Russian people. I call on Russia to immediately stop the violence and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine's territory. We will not let President Putin tear down the security architecture that has given Europe peace and stability over many decades. We will not allow President Putin to replace the rule of law by the rule of force and ruthlessness.
French President Emmanuel Macron says his country will respond without weakness to Russia's act of war against Ukraine, saying Russia should expect tough sanctions that would hit its military, its economy, and its energy sector. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says Russia has launched a cold-blooded, long-planned invasion.
This is a grave moment for the security of Europe. Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine is putting countless innocent lives at risk. With air and missile attacks, ground forces and special forces from multiple directions, targeting military infrastructure and major urban centers. This is a deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion. Despite its litany of lies, denials and disinformation, the Kremlin's intentions are clear for the world to see. Russia's leaders bear full responsibility for their reckless actions and the lives lost.
Ukrainian state air traffic services has closed the country's airspace. Traffic jams have formed in the capital, Kiev, as residents try to leave the city. Residents have also sought shelter in stations and queues forming for buses, cash points and petrol.
In the meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging global leaders to provide defense assistance to Ukraine and help protect its airspace from Russia. In a statement that comes amidst Russia's wide-ranging attack, Mr. Zelensky said that Russia has unleashed a war with Ukraine and the entire democratic world. He also adds that Ukraine was defending itself alone. He's asking for world leaders to provide large-scale defense support and to protect Ukraine's airspace from what he terms the aggressor. For the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, he says this is the saddest moment in his tenure as chief of the global body.
This is the saddest moment in my tenure as Secretary General of the United Nations. I started this meeting of the Security Council addressing President Putin and telling him from the bottom of my heart, stop your troops from an offensive to Ukraine, give peace a chance, because too many people have already died. During the meeting, President Putin announced a special military operation in the Donbass and required the Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms. So in the present circumstances, I must change my appeal. And I must say, President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
Back here, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the House of Representatives is calling for the immediate evacuation of Nigerians in that troubled country. The motion was moved by Honorable Ahmed Munir during plenary, where the lawmaker expressed concern that there are many Nigerian students in Ukraine who could be caught in the crossfire. But some lawmakers fear that it may already be too late, as the evacuations should have been done long ago.
Hours after Russia attacked Ukraine, following the tension of war that has built up in the past weeks, lawmakers in the House of Representatives call for an urgent evacuation of Nigerians in Ukraine, even as some fear that it may be rather too late.
Concerned that if a strategic plan is not put in place to secure and provide safe passage for our citizens, they may be trapped or worse, harmed. The President of the United States of America, about 4 or 5 days ago, said that he said with certainty that it was imminent that President Putin would order his forces into Ukraine. That was the period within which we should have used to evacuate our people from that country.
We must look for how best to evacuate our citizens who are locked up in Ukraine, especially the students, because their case is very, very, very unique.
The urgency of the situation prompts the House to turn to a man who voluntarily offered to evacuate Nigerians from South Africa during the xenophobic attacks in 2019 and stranded Nigerians from the United Kingdom following the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020, Allen Onyema.
We have somebody in this country that is very humane and is ever ready in this type of situation. Chairman Air Peace, we should appeal to him the way he did it before.
I think the leader of the House, the chairman of Foreign Affairs, should liaise with the Foreign Affairs Ministry today.
With all sense
and
of
if nothing positive comes out of that meeting and it's all about red tape, we have to do this, we have to do that, I think you should liaise with the chairman Air Peace.
Yes.
And whatever it's going to cost the House, whatever we need to do, I think we need to leave this. You need to leave this country latest tomorrow, and head to Ukraine and head on back by Monday with as many students or citizens who are willing to come back.
As the House considers evacuation of Nigerians, there are concerns about the possibility of that evacuation, considering that Ukraine has shut its airspace to civilian flights. Terry Ikumi, Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, the Nigerian embassy in Ukraine has called for calm and vigilance amongst Nigerians resident there. In a travel advisory by the embassy, the mission urges Nigerians to be more proactive with their personal safety. It adds that citizens who may be uncomfortable with the development can relocate to safer places of their choice, but must ensure they validate their resident documents for ease of return. For students seeking temporary relocation, the embassy advised them to seek proper clearance and guarantees from their institutions. And as concerns heighten over the safety of Nigerians in Ukraine, the federal government says it is planning their evacuation to get them out of danger once that country's airports are reopened. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jeffrey Onyema, told Channels Television in his office in Abuja that the government wants the adoption of a highly tactical approach to ensure that the conflict does not become bigger.
Our first priority is to the Nigerian citizens that find themselves in Ukraine at the moment. We've been engaging over the last 3 weeks with our embassy in the Ukraine, and I've been personally in touch with the ambassador on almost daily basis since then. And of course, the big challenge was whether to issue a travel advisory for all the Nigerian students and others living in Ukraine to leave. Now, an advisory was given that those who felt the need to leave should do so. The consensus amongst the diplomatic representation of the various countries in Ukraine was that the citizens should stay. Of course, Russia was asserting that they were not going to invade, while of course the US, as we know, and some other Western countries were saying that an invasion was imminent. So it was difficult to know who to really believe. The Ukrainian government was assuring the citizens there that they should just go about their normal business. And some Nigerian students who were interviewed, said that, to all intents and purposes, they were totally oblivious and unaware of any crisis, and it was just when they turned on the news or whatever that they heard that there might be there's some issues. So so the advice from our mission was not to panic, but importantly a hotline was set up by the embassy and reaching out to all the Nigerians and letting them know the number which they can call if they were in any kind of trouble. Now, of course, the attack, military action, is underway. I've been in touch with the ambassador today. He's reassured me of the safety of the Nigerians in the Ukraine, and very importantly that so far, all the attacks have been against military installations, in the Ukraine. So that's the situation as of now. But of course, the airports are closed, and I've told him that there are 5 airports. Inform the Nigerians who are still in the Ukraine that once the airports are reopened, that arrange in an organized fashion for those who feel that they want to leave to go to the nearest airports to them, and we will see then how we can assist for them to leave the country. Well, some are going by land, crossing into Poland and some of these countries. Our advice from the embassy is to stay calm, stay in their residence, and once there is an opportunity, the airport opening up, we'll have a coordinated approach to getting them out. So all the resources available to the embassy will be directed towards an orderly, a process of evacuating those who want to leave. We have good relations with Russia. We have good relations with Ukraine as well, which is why we are urging for diplomacy. And of course, we have good relations with the U.S. We're members of the United Nations and would, this matter will almost certainly come up within the United Nations. And our position would always be to avoid violence and military conflict and to prioritize under all circumstances, peaceful resolution of disputes and prioritizing dialogue and diplomacy.
Nigeria's Foreign Affairs Minister Jeffrey Onyema. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll tell you about the fluctuation of oil prices as well as discuss what the possible impact of this could be to the outside world, particularly Nigeria. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back to our program, special program, Russian Invasion. Oil prices jumped nearly 3% today as Russia's invasion of Ukraine stoked global supply concerns as markets brace for the potential impact of trade sanctions on major crude exporter Russia. Global benchmark Brent crude rose $1.90 to $100.98 a barrel, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude climbed $1.74 to $94.54 a barrel. The attack on Ukraine caused prices to surge to more than $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014 yesterday, with Brent touching $105 before paring back gains by the close of trade. The massed Russian assault by land, sea, and air is the biggest attack on a European state since World War II, prompting tens of thousands of people to flee their homes. Let's take a slightly deeper look at the economic impact of the war in Ukraine. I'm being joined by Dr. Mouda Yusuf. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. Dr. Yusuf, thank you for your time. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning.
Ordinarily, we should benefit, countries like Nigeria should benefit from this scenario, because if Russia, which is one of the biggest exporters of crude oil in the world, is under sanctions, Nigeria should be one of those to step into the plate. Is that going to be the situation?
Well, certainly not, and unfortunately. Because at a time like this, oil-producing countries should be smiling, because they should be reaping from the benefits of the windfall, just as we had during the Gulf War and all of that. But unfortunately, the reverse is the case in Nigeria, and it's a big paradox. First, we are going to see a hike in subsidy payment, because I mean, few weeks ago, we were talking about a subsidy of around 3 trillion. Now, this may even go up higher. We may be talking about 4 trillion or something above. And we know the very serious fiscal implications that that has. First, it has implications for fiscal deficit. Already we are talking about a deficit of 6.8 trillion. The president just transmitted supplementary budgets of 2.55 trillion. So normally that should push up the deficit to close to 9 trillion. Now we have this development. With this development, the deficit level is likely to go up, which is going to create a whole lot of issues around our fiscal operations. Secondly, and flowing from that is the fact that the level of debt, because if you have a higher deficit, you have to fund it. And where is it? So the debt level is likely to increase. The debt service commitment is likely to increase. And because of the way we fund deficit, particularly with the CBN window and all of that, we are likely to see an even worse situation with inflation, which will be very unfortunate because the economy is still struggling to recover from the shocks of all of these problems. But now we are paying a very big price for the dysfunctional policy and regulatory environment in our oil and gas sector. This is the price we are paying now, and it's a very, very big price. Secondly, energy prices. High energy price has implications also for inflation. The cost of diesel before now has gone up to over 400 per litre. With this development, we're likely to see a higher cost of diesel. And you know what happens when diesel prices go up. First, many of the factories and institutions that use generators, most of these generators are running on diesel. So that's increased cost. Many factories that are running on generators, that is additional cost. There are many of these trucks, in fact, most of them, that crisscross the country, moving products from one part of the country to they are running on diesel. So we are likely to see a pass-through effect on inflation, which is also a very unfortunate thing. So these are some of these, and the allocation to FARC. FARC revenue is probably also likely to crash because the capacity of NNPC to remit to FARC is going to drop significantly.
Because you need to fund...
You need to fund deficits.
Yes.
So this is likely to consume the entire revenue coming from NNPC. And when the allocation to FARC begins to drop, this will have very serious implications, especially for states that are dependent heavily on FARC. So you can see the multidimensional effect. And once you begin to have this kind of fiscal operation, it also has a way of affecting the exchange rate. Because the more you get the CBN to fund to fill all of these gaps, it blows up the money supply. When money supply increases, it also has implications for inflation. It has implications for implications for further depreciation of the currency. So we are going to take a very big hit from this, unfortunately, because we are still struggling with some, macroeconomic issues, the PIA, the subsidy, and now we have this. So this is going to be a major blow on this economy.
I'm happy you said that because, of course, that brings it home to us here because on first glance, many people would say, oh, look, Ukraine is in Europe, Nigeria is here in Africa. But if we take a more global perspective now, we've heard so much about sanctions and the potential for those sanctions to bring Russia to negotiations and make them stop this invasion. But again, economically, several people have pointed out that Russia is not without its own sanctions that it can impose, without its own leverage that it can take against the Western powers and, in fact, against the Ukraine and surrounding countries if they try to come to the aid of the Ukraine. But speaking more globally, we're just coming out of the COVID-19-induced recession worldwide, and then this. So on a broader perspective, how is that likely to play out, do you think?
Well, this is also a very big shock on the global economy. Just as you said, the global economy is still struggling to recover from the effects of the pandemic. Many countries have not even fully recovered. Now we have this major shock. First, Putin is not likely to back down on account of these sanctions because it's not bordered. His main objective is this territorial thing. He wants to demilitarize Ukraine and possibly even annex it. And from the pronouncement from NATO and these other allies, US, they don't want to physically engage in war. So they are relying on sanctions. And for a man that doesn't care, and is ruling a country in a very repressive way. So even if you impose sanctions and the people are feeling there's very little protest that can come from within because of the repressive nature of that regime. Having said that, this is beginning to have effects globally. First, uncertainty is a very big issue in the global economy. And that is what is translating now. If you look at equity stock prices, the Dow, the Nasdaq, the S&P, they're already declining on account of that. And just as you said, Russia accounts for about 40 or more % of the gas to Europe. And if he denies them that, that's going to create a major crisis in Europe. And of course, globally, that will affect gas prices, even including us in Nigeria. And you know, many of these European countries, even in the US, one of the problems they have been grappling with in the last few years or 1 year is problem of inflation. Inflation has reached levels that they have not witnessed in the last 40 years. In US, in UK, and in Europe. So this is going to further worsen the inflationary situation in Europe. Because there's a very strong relationship or correlation between energy prices and inflation in Europe.
Yeah, because so many people are dependent on that.
Yes, they are dependent on gas for a lot of things. They're also dependent on these petroleum products
for movement around, for powering the industries. And
so it's going to have a major effect across practically all countries. You know, so that is another major issue. Then, of course, between Russia and Ukraine, they account for about 30% of the export of wheat globally. Wheat is a major produce, a staple for practically all countries, even including Nigeria. We import a lot of wheat. So I will not be surprised if this is even affecting the price of bread, you know, as low as that. Because between Russia and Ukraine, they export a lot of wheat. So that is another major effect. So these are some of the global issues that. So if Putin decides to either cut off supply to Europe in terms of the supply of gas, that is going to hit the European communities very, very highly. The same thing because the pipeline is passing through Ukraine to supply Europe.
Yeah.
So Ukraine may decide, of course, to also sabotage that in order to create challenges for Putin or for Russia. So these are things. Generally, it's going to create a major issue for the global economy. And there are also fears that Russia is very good in cyber attacks. And through that, a lot of havoc. Because the way the guy is going, there's nothing he cannot do. God is not somebody that can be held to account even by his own people because of the kind of influence and the kind of power and the kind of autocratic regime that is running. So there's a whole lot of damage that this will cause, and it's going to cause a major setback. And of course, it's going to, because you can't compare the military might of Ukraine to that of Russia. And in any case, the man has almost incapacitated their military might. Because he's starting now by bombing all the military installations. And the NATO and US, all of them said they cannot engage physically. So you are allowed to have an Afghanistan situation. That it will just be easy for, just as the Taliban overran the the Afghanistan when the US
when
left.
the US left, yeah.
These people don't have the capacity to face the Russians. The president has been calling on civilians, and what can the civilians do? You know, in the face of this massive onslaught, and this man has fully mobilized for this onslaught.
Yeah.
He's fully mobilized for it. So within a matter of weeks, I think he will just conveniently overrun.
Take
Then
over
we
the
now,
country,
yeah,
and
take
then we'll
over
now
the
be
country.
faced with the aftermath.
Yes, we will face because, and this is not going to go away because a lot of damage will have been caused. So these sanctions are likely to remain for a very long time.
Indeed.
With all its disruptive effects, you know, on the global economy and of course on us, even because of the vulnerable situation that we find ourselves.
Dr. Yusuf, for sure you'll be back on this program in the days and weeks to come to examine as the situation unfolds and when the actual impact begins to take effect and we begin to see it practically. I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Well, it isn't only economically that we have difficulty, as we're being joined from our Abuja studios by David Otto. He's a security analyst. David, welcome to the program. We've talked about the economic aspects of this with Dr. Yusuf. Now, in terms of the security, Dr. Yusuf in his last statement touched on that briefly, that the military situation looks very dire for the Ukrainians and even for surrounding countries. Is that your reading of the situation 24 hours into this invasion?
Yes, of course. That's the assessment. You'd remember that, of course, that the United States and NATO had warned that, the Russians were already ready to attack. They were ready to invade Ukraine. And, of course, we know that Russia had denied that it will do that. Of course, when you look at the manner in which all this was being done, I mean, it was rather inevitable that at some point this will happen. We've got to always go back to the underlying causes. Russia is adamant that Ukraine should not be a member of NATO because, of its own territorial integrity and, being concerned about the fact that that will then threaten its own national security. On the other hand, the United States and its NATO allies, they want to make sure that, they can, bring Ukraine in order for them to kind of ring fence Russia from a security perspective. The danger here, as we've seen always, is that Ukraine will pay the ultimate price. The United States has made it very clear that it will not engage directly, but we know, of course, that other NATO members have also made it very clear that they will support, Ukraine in this crisis. I think it does remind us, just to look at the history, that this is a reversal of what happened in the 1960s, on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this time, everything has been reversed. But I think what is very critical is that if you look at the order of battle, we would see some, military gains being made by Russia because of its pure brute force that it has. But, this is not going to be an easy invasion. There is one thing to invade a country. There's one thing to bombard it by air. There's one thing to use your land forces or your sea might. But, there's another thing for you to govern it. So what we're going to experience, I am certain, is that, yes, Ukraine will be invaded by Russia. It will be, tombed, using the Russian might. But it will be very challenging for Russia to govern because, of course, of the kind of support that Ukraine will have. So we're likely to see the same situation when Russia or the then Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and the United States, then supported the Mujahideens, to then make it very difficult for Russia to stay in Afghanistan. So we will see the same situation. But Russia would have achieved this aim to ensure that Ukraine remains destabilized and therefore will not be able to be a member of NATO. So this is what we're seeing here. We're experiencing a global war with a global impact on the basis of whether a country should be a member of NATO or not.
Now, the idea, of course, is that this is all about containment on both sides. As you pointed out, the United States wanted the Ukraine to join NATO and possibly the EU as a member so that on the borders of Russia, there is a friendly country, so to speak. The Russians saw that as an expansion which threatened their own, what they call security and stability, because that would be their backyard, and they had made it clear that they wanted guarantees that that was not going to happen. Otherwise, what we're now witnessing was what was going to be the result. Now, which one of this, I mean, talking militarily or security-wise, on either side, was this a solid strategy to begin with?
I doubt if, in terms of looking at global peace and stability, I don't think we should be having in the 21st century fighting wars over membership. It is very clear that NATO wants to get as close as they can to ensure that, they can monitor and in the event that there is a military confrontation between NATO and Russia, then it makes it very much more easier for NATO to then strike. Vladimir Putin also understands that, Ukraine is the last bastion, so they do not want to let this happen. Vladimir Putin has made it very clear that the only way and the only solution to this crisis, now a war as it is that Ukraine categorically refuses to join NATO. Now, again, this is an infringement of international law. I mean, you cannot then ask a country which is sovereign not to have membership of an international organization. But of course, Russia is also looking at its own national interest. I mean, that is why I think, as many others, that Ukraine is bearing the brunt of the confrontation between Russia today, or the old Soviet Union, and NATO, as you have it. But is this some kind of a long-lasting strategy? I don't think so. What we would say is a situation where there is going to be a war of attrition. Russia is going to achieve part of its aim, to ensure that Ukraine does not become a member of NATO. But indirectly, what is happening now is that NATO members will begin to support, Ukraine. They will then arm Ukraine, and then it also gives an ability for NATO members to indirectly, send their troops in to fight against the Soviet Union, Russia, and that gives, the indirect, kind of achievement that Russia was, worried about. Now we would say, NATO supporting Ukraine more, as we've seen in terms of sanctions which have been levied against Russia. It would weaken its economy. I'm sure that Russia may have already devised a way to survive. This is not something that is new to Russia, sanctions. But Russia will have its own, deficiencies, when these sanctions begin to deepen. But what we see here, again, just to be very clear, is that it is the ordinary Ukrainians that will suffer. A lot of countries, including Nigeria, would have to think well about, the well-being of their citizens. They would have to think about evacuations. So it is a global crisis, that is being fought over, whether one country should be a member of NATO or not. Should it happen, in my opinion, I think this is something that could be resolved, through appeasement. And this is where we think, the United Nations and other international organizations, even the African Union, should be getting involved. But it is very clear that when the big boys are fighting, then it seems, they have the decisions and, they do what they like. This is the unfortunate situation that we are in.
There are those who have already pointed out that history, there's a sense of deja vu about all of this. A very strong country takes on a much weaker one and says, don't do this, otherwise this is what is going to happen. Takes us all the way back to 1938-39 and the start of what eventually became a much bigger conflict, drawing in a whole host of countries, started that way. Already NATO, as we speak, is bolstering its forces in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and all of that, and Poland. And already there are other countries which are lining up for help from NATO because they fear that this is only the beginning, that Russia is not going to stop with the Ukraine. So what do you see as the end game in all of this?
I think the Russians have to think very strategically. We've seen a similar situation in Afghanistan, where an overwhelming force by the United States was used against the Taliban government. I mean, this is a replica of that. But what history, as you rightly mentioned, has taught us is that you may invade a country, you can bomb it, you can occupy the country, but you will not be able to govern it. No matter how powerful your propaganda mechanism is, no matter how powerful your cyber strategy will be. I think the biggest worry for Russia now is, yes, we might have the capacity to invade Ukraine, but do we really have the capacity to govern it? And I'm sure that, I don't think that would be the end goal for Vladimir Putin to then, govern Ukraine at some point. Perhaps that may be, but I think that would be his biggest challenge. Now, most wars, they have their biggest casualties, during the first phase of bombardment and airstrikes, but it will be during the occupation and governance period. I mean, if this is not supported by the Ukraine population, I mean, of course, Russia argues that Ukraine has a huge Russian-backed population. But, I think the biggest challenge that will be for Vladimir Putin is, actually staying in Ukraine, not actually invading it. And I think this is where the NATO-backed US allies have the upper hand. If they then, give Ukraine the support that Ukraine desires, then it becomes very challenging. But the end game will be achieved. Ukraine will not be a member of NATO as it's required, because, of course, being a member of NATO, you're expected not to have any ongoing crisis, or war in your country. And Russia knows that. So it's going to be very challenging. But again, the biggest worry is that, we are experiencing almost a global war on the basis of membership of NATO. This shouldn't happen in the 21st century.
Indeed, it shouldn't. And I know that David Otto will be talking a bit more as this unfolds in the days and possibly weeks to come. Thank you for your thoughts on the program this morning.
Thank you.
We'll take a break now. It isn't only in the military and economic spheres that the invasion of the Ukraine is having impact. We'll tell you about some of those repercussions in the sports world. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. UEFA is set to move the Champions League final from the Russian city of St. Petersburg owing to the escalating situation in neighboring Ukraine. The final of the Showpiece football tournament was due to take place at the 68,000 capacity Gazprom Arena in St. Petersburg on May the 28th. But UEFA President Alexander Seferin has called an extraordinary meeting of the Executive Committee for today to confirm the decision to move the match. The Ukrainian Football Association also wants the 2023 UEFA Super Cup final to be moved from Kazan in Russia and have asked FIFA and UEFA to ban Russian teams from their competitions. FIFA President Gianni Infantino has called for a rapid cessation of the Ukraine conflict while confirming that Russia's World Cup 22 playoff game against Poland next month is being reviewed as a matter of urgency. Russia is scheduled to host a playoff semifinal against Poland on March the 24th in Moscow for the right to also host the winner of a meeting between the Czech Republic and Sweden for a place in Qatar.
Condemns as well the use of force by Russia in Ukraine and any type of violence to resolve conflicts. Any type of violence. Because violence is never a solution. And therefore, we call on all parties to restore peace through constructive dialogue. And of course, FIFA continues to express our solidarity to the people affected.
Manchester City defender Alexander Zinchenko and former AC Milan striker Andriy Shevchenko are among prominent sporting stars from Ukraine to have called for solidarity within their country as political tension in the region escalates. A group of Brazilian footballers who play in Ukraine pleaded for help yesterday in leaving the country, saying Russia's invasion had left them stranded in a Kiev hotel where they had sought refuge. And players from Barcelona and Napoli have united in support of an anti-war message before their Europa League game in Italy. All 22 starters from the match posed for a pre-match photograph as they stood behind a large banner which read, "Stop War." It was a response to President Vladimir Putin's instructing his troops to attack Ukraine before blasts were reported in Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv. And the basketball club in Barcelona has cancelled its trip to Russia for the EuroLeague games against Zenit Petersburg and CSKA Moscow. The decision to suspend their current trip was made at the airport in Barcelona just minutes before the private flight to Russia was due to leave. And finally, in what appears to be good news and bad news, Russian tennis star Daniil Medvedev has become world #1. Medvedev becomes the first man since 2004 outside the game's big four of Novak Djokovic, Rafael Nadal, Roger Federer, and Andy Murray to occupy the #1 spot. He also becomes the third Russian man after Yevgeny Kafelnikov and Marat Safin to ascend to the top spot. In his reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Medvedev said, "By being a tennis player, I want to promote peace all over the world. We're playing so many different countries. I've been in so many different places as a junior and as a professional. It is just not easy to hear all this news. I am all for peace." And it's on that clarion call note for peace from the tennis star Daniil Medvedev that we end this maiden edition of the Russian invasion. There'll be another edition of the program at 5 o'clock later on this evening with Amarachi Ubani and Millicent Walker. Do join us for that. We'll be back on Monday as well with a fresh edition of the program at 9 a.m. I'm Ladi Akiri Dulali. Good morning.